The sky was already on fire when Captain Noah Reyes gripped the rail of his ship. A deafening roar split the horizon as jets screamed overhead, their contrails slashing the dawn like white scars on blood-red clouds. From the deck, he could see flames curling from the carcass of a cruiser smoke, rising in black columns that swallowed the Sunday. Alarms wailed, men shouted, but Reyes' mind froze on one brutal fact: the enemy had arrived with a power they were never supposed to possess. In that chaos, his eyes locked on May Alvarez, the fearless pilot of the squadron, scrambling from the carrier. Her jet thundered down the deck wings, glinting against the haze. Reyes felt both pride and dread twist in his chest. She was his edge, his last line against a storm that seemed unstoppable. Yet he knew sending her into the sky was like throwing glass into a hurricane. What struck him hardest was the paradox. Only hours before his crew had been laughing, convinced their fleet was untouchable, that industrial might and cutting-edge technology made them invincible. Now those same men stared in horror at the Leviathan surfacing on the horizon, a fortress ship the size of a city, bristling with weapons too massive to comprehend. The arrogance of certainty had turned into the terror of helplessness in a single breath. Beyond that burning sea stretched the fate of the war itself. Midway, the turning point of the Pacific was no longer a distant name in a briefing. It was here alive, demanding blood and steel. Reyes knew this clash would decide not only who ruled the ocean, but whether freedom could survive the age of superweapons. The choice was no longer victory or defeat. It was survival or extinction. The ocean was still smoldering from the morning assault when night fell like a heavy curtain over the Pacific. The sea was restless, reflecting streaks of red from the burning wrecks still adrift on the horizon. Captain Noah Reyes stood on the bridge of his frigate, his hands gripping the railing until his knuckles turned white. He had thought the worst was behind them, but the silence now was heavier than gunfire, a silence that screamed of something approaching. The fleet was stretched in formation, a massive carrier at the center, its deck lined with planes ready for launch, flanked by cruisers and destroyers cutting sharp silhouettes against the dusk. It was the image of power, yet Reyes felt the tremor of dread beneath it all. Below deck in the Combat Information Center, the glow of radar screens bathed the room in an eerie green. The Chief of Electronic Warfare, Commander Tate, leaned forward, sweat beading his temple. He had been staring at the ghostly blips flickering in and out of existence for nearly an hour. "Something's there," he muttered, his voice tight. "But it doesn't want to be seen." Reyes came down, his eyes drawn to the static dancing across the screens. The blips weren't enemy fighters or subs. They were too big, too deliberate, moving like a shadow stalking the fleet.
Oh my God!
And then it happened. The horizon lit up with a faint shimmer, as though the ocean itself had split open to reveal something buried beneath.
Mayday! Mayday!
Out of
We're
the
taking
darkness,
heavy fire!
a colossal
I can't
shape
get a lock!
emerged. The fleet had heard rumors, whispers of a vessel unlike anything built before, but no one had believed it. Now it loomed in front of them, dwarfing even their carrier. A fortress afloat its hull, plated with obsidian metal that drank in the light edges so sharp it seemed carved out of night itself. It moved with the weight of inevitability, silent, terrifying, a god of war rising from the abyss. "Contact confirmed," Tate said hoarsely, his voice cracking. The alarms blared red lights, flooding the ship as orders were shouted across every deck. Reyes turned to the horizon, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Launch the squadron," he commanded, his voice steady, despite the dread clawing inside him. On the carrier deck, May Alvarez climbed into her cockpit, her helmet snapping into place. She didn't look back at the men strapping her in. Her squadron roared to life engines howling, and one by one the jets leapt into the night sky, their afterburners cutting streaks of fire into the dark. The first salvo came without warning. The fortress ship opened its flanks, and from its belly spewed a storm of plasma bolts that tore through the night like falling stars. A destroyer off Reyes' starboard side was hit instantly, its deck exploding in a geyser of flame. The shockwave slammed into the frigate, tossing men to the floor. Reyes caught himself against the rail, teeth gritted as screams echoed from below. In the sky above, May's squadron dove into the chaos, missiles streaking like lightning toward the behemoth. Dogfight erupted in a furious ballet. Enemy fighters appeared from the shadows, sleek machines built for speed and death swarming like locusts around May's group. Her voice crackled through the comms, clipped and sharp, issuing commands to her pilots. She banked hard left, locking onto a target, her missiles finding their mark. The explosion lit her canopy, but the victory was hollow. An enemy wingman swooped behind one of her squad mates, shredding his jet with a hail of cannon fire. Reyes heard the pilot's scream cut off mid-word before static filled the channel. The burning wreck spiraled into the ocean, a brief comet that vanished beneath the waves. On the surface, the fleet fought back with everything it had. Cruiser guns thundered, flares streaked skyward, the carrier unleashing wave after wave of interceptors.
Surrounded!
But every strike against the enemy fortress was swallowed by its armor. Shells, ricocheted missiles, exploded harmlessly against its blackened hull. The fortress advanced undeterred its weapons, tearing through steel and men alike. One broadside unleashed a curtain of molten projectiles that rained down like the wrath of gods, igniting the sea itself in patches of burning oil. Reyes's frigate was thrown into the thick of it, battered by shockwaves and fire. Tate shouted from below, "We're in their blind zone, but not for long." Reyes saw it too, the tactical map bleeding red. The enemy fortress was turning its weapons, aligning like an executioner raising the blade. But amidst the carnage, Reyes' eyes caught something, a crippled destroyer listing badly, her crew scrambling on the deck, waving frantic signals for help. She was doomed, caught in the kill zone, her engines dead, her men helpless. Every instinct told him to hold position to keep his frigate out of the slaughter that was seconds away. But Reyes couldn't tear his eyes from those men stranded on a dying ship. The thought of leaving them there was unbearable. His jaw clenched, his decision already made before the words left his lips. "Bring us about full throttle. We're going in." The helmsman hesitated, eyes wide with disbelief. Reyes's roar cut through the bridge. "Do it now," engine screamed, as the frigate swung into the kill zone, rushing toward the crippled vessel. Alarms wailed louder, drowning in the pounding of the enemy, guns preparing to fire. May's voice broke through the comms. "Captain, get out of there, you won't make it." But Reyes didn't answer. His eyes were locked forward, his will set like iron. The frigate surged ahead, its bow cutting into firelit waters, the looming shadow of the fortress bearing down. Then it came. The enemy unleashed its fury, the night ripped apart by a storm of fire. A wall of plasma crashed across the waves, engulfing everything in its path. The frigate shuddered violently, metal shrieking as sparks rained from the ceiling. Men were hurled against bulkheads, lights burst in showers of glass. Outside, the crippled destroyer caught fire its deck, an inferno of twisting steel. Reyes gritted his teeth, clinging to the rail, as though by sheer will he could hold the ship together. And in the sky above, May's jet dove through the inferno tracer round, streaking around her. She screamed into her comms, cover them now." Her squadron followed, breaking formation, tearing through enemy fighters in a desperate attempt to shield the frigate. But the night was merciless. Reyes looked up just in time to see one of May's pilots take a direct hit. The jet erupted in a fireball debris, scattering like sparks across the dark sea before vanishing into black water. The bridge shook again. The frigate was now fully inside the kill zone, alarms howling, every man bracing for the final blow. Reyes' heart hammered not in fear but in defiance. He could hear it, that long wail of the emergency siren, shrill and unending, cutting through the chaos like a scream from the soul of the ship. The sound merged with the roar of engines, with the thunder of battle, with the cries of dying men. It was the anthem of doom, but also of defiance. Through the smoke, through the flame, Reyes saw the crippled destroyer's crew still alive, still waving, their faces lit by fire. He locked his eyes on them, refusing to look away, as if his will alone could drag them from death. And then silence, a breathless pause, before the sky itself seemed to collapse. A jet spiraled down its burning carcass, trailing fire, crashing into the sea between the ships with an explosion that lit the night like a second Sunday. The shockwave tore across the frigate, the alarm still shrieking, the world suspended in chaos. That was the moment Reyes knew there was no turning back. The fortress had brought war to the heart of the Pacific, and he was standing in its path. The siren
Phoenix
wailed
Squadron,
on the sea,
climate
burning
hold
around
pattern.
them, as the battle for survival had only just begun. The night had ended in fire, but the morning brought no reprieve. Black smoke still drifted across the horizon where ships burned, and the sea was littered with wreckage that bobbed like the bones of giants. Captain Reyes's frigate was limping, wounded yet defiant, locked inside the shadow of the colossal fortress. Above it all, the sky churned with storm clouds, a boiling canvas of gray and green. Thunder rolled like distant artillery, and the wind ripped across the decks with a howl that carried the scent of oil, salt, and death. From the carrier, the next phase of the battle was already in motion. May Alvarez stood at the edge of the flight deck, her visor reflecting the violent storm overhead. Her squadron had been battered during the night assault, and the losses still hung heavy in her chest. She remembered the scream of her wingman cut short the fireball spiraling into the black ocean. It clawed at her the same way memories of her brother did killed in a Pacific raid years before, a wound that had never closed. But grief had become her steel. She pulled down her helmet, sealed it shut, and climbed into her jet. The deck thundered with activity. Bombers lined up for launch, their bellies loaded with payloads designed to punch holes in steel. Heavy interceptors roared to life, their turbines shaking the deck like an earthquake. Overhead drones with sleek, angular frames shot upward like shards of metal piercing the sky, their red lights blinking in unison. This was no longer a skirmish. It was the storm's heart. The launch was chaos and poetry combined. One by one, jets screamed down the carrier deck and hurled themselves into the turbulent sky. May's jet was third in line, its afterburners lighting up as she slammed the throttle forward. The world blurred, and then she was airborne, the ocean vanishing beneath her as the storm swallowed her whole. Rain streaked her canopy, lightning forked across the clouds, and her HUD flickered with target designations. Phoenix Squadron airborne, she reported, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. Inside the clouds, the world was disorienting, a labyrinth of vapor and electricity. Jets darted in and out of view like predators in fog. May's radar lit up with hostile signals. The enemy was waiting. They came fast, their sleek black silhouettes cutting through the storm like blades. Missiles locked, cannons fired, and the sky erupted into a furious dance of death. From her cockpit, May saw the ocean far below, tiny ships dwarfed by the immensity of the sea. It struck her how fragile they were, how small compared to the Leviathan fortress that had risen against them. Yet every man on those ships fought with a courage that burned brighter than the storm itself. She gritted her teeth and dove headfirst into the chaos. The battle unfolded in layers of vertical war stretching from the ocean's skin to the stratosphere. Bombers climbed higher, heavy engines, groaning their escorts, weaving protective screens of fire around them. Interceptors clashed in dogfights that spun wildly through clouds, tracer rounds carving fiery scars into the mist. Missiles streaked like meteors, their trails slicing the storm, followed by explosions that shook the air. May's voice cut through the comms. Break left now. Her squadron obeyed, scattering as a swarm of enemy. Fighters screamed through cannons blazing. One of her wingmen barely avoided the barrage, his jet tumbling into a spiral before recovering. May looped around her jet, straining under the G-force, her breath ragged inside her helmet. She lined up a target, locked, and fired. The missile streaked away, piercing the storm before detonating against an enemy fuselage. The fireball illuminated the clouds like a second Sunday. The battle raged with brutal rhythm.
Oh my God!
Every second was a coin flip between life and annihilation. The tactical advisor's voice crackled in her ear, issuing orders from the carrier.
We're taking heavy fire!
Phoenix Squadron, focus on the launchers. Intelligence confirms the fortress has surface batteries prepping for a full salvo. If they fire, the fleet won't survive. May's jaw tightened. The thought of the fleet of Reyes, still fighting below, ignited something in her. This wasn't just another sortie. It was survival. She led her squadron down through the storm, punching through the cloud cover until the ocean snapped back into view. There it was, the fortress, its black hull gleaming with rain, its massive surface alive with light as missile silos opened like the mouths of beasts. Towering launchers extended upward, preparing to unleash a firestorm that would tear through everything afloat. May's HUD lit up with red warnings, the scale of the threat screaming in bold letters. The squadron dove in formation. Bombers unleashed their payloads, the ocean boiling where ordnance struck. Drones swarmed the fortress, strafing its decks, exploding in sacrificial bursts. Enemy fighters met them head-on, forcing interceptors into knife-edge turns and violent collisions. The air itself seemed to combust under the sheer weight of firepower. May's pulse hammered as her jet shuddered from near misses. She pulled up hard, nearly blacking out from the force before swinging back into the fight.
I can't hold them off.
"Target the launchers," she shouted. Her squadron answered, missiles raining down. One launcher erupted in flame, but 3 more remained, their cores glowing as they prepared to fire. She knew the truth in her bones. There wasn't enough time, not enough firepower. The fleet would be obliterated unless someone closed the gap, unless someone struck from within reach. She steadied her breath, her decision blooming with clarity even as terror gnawed at her edges. Her brother's face flashed before her eyes, not in sorrow, but in resolve. She would not let another family watch the ocean swallow their kin. "Command, I'm going in," May said. Silence followed, then a desperate voice crackled back. "Negative, Alvarez. That's suicide." She didn't answer. She throttled forward her jet, screaming into a steep dive. The storm roared around her, the ocean rushing up like a wall of steel. Her targeting system locked onto the central launcher, its warhead glowing brighter by the second. Time fractured.
We're
The
surrounded!
world slowed. The thunder of engines faded to a hollow silence. She saw every raindrop sliding across her canopy.
Move!
Every flicker of flame from the battle behind her. Her heartbeat was the only sound, pounding in rhythm, with the lock tone blaring in her ears. She whispered into the void a promise to her brother, to Reyes, to every man still fighting below. This ends now. Her jet struck like a dagger. The missile launcher ignited as her warhead detonated, a chain reaction ripping across the fortress's surface. A bloom of fire rose high into the storm, tearing the night open with blinding light. The shockwave ripped through the sky, scattering friend and foe alike. On the carrier deck miles away, men shielded their eyes as the explosion lit the horizon. Reyes, watching from his bridge, felt his throat tighten as her
Target
comms
locked.
went dead, replaced only by static. He knew what she had done, what it had cost. The fortress staggered its launch, crippled its salvo delayed. For the first time, the impossible enemy bled. The fleet had a chance to breathe. But that chance had been bought with fire, with sacrifice, with May Alvarez's name carved into the storm. The fireball from May's sacrifice still burned in the clouds when the war shifted beneath the surface. The fortress had been wounded but not destroyed. Its guns still roared, its decks still bristled with fighters. And in the silence below the storm, another predator had begun to move. The Pacific was no longer just a battlefield of steel and fire above the waves. It had become a hunting ground in the black abyss below. Commander Tate, head of electronic warfare, sat hunched over a bank of glowing monitors deep inside Reyes's frigate. His face was pale in the sickly green light sweat dripping down his temple. He had been tracking faint anomalies on the sonar net signatures that flickered in and out like whispers. "They're here," he muttered, his voice low more to himself than anyone else. Submarines, fast attack running silent. Beneath the fleet, the enemy stalked like wolves. Sleek subs slid through the water, their hulls designed to swallow sound, their propellers whispering like breath in a tomb. They crept toward the carrier group, the crown jewel of the fleet, their torpedo tubes already primed. In the black silence of the deep, the only sound was the sonar ping, dull, haunting, reverberating like the heartbeat of the ocean. On the screens, Tate watched as the anomalies split, multiplied. "They're flanking us. They're pushing for the carrier," he snapped. The room erupted into orders. Destroyers armed with depth charges peeled away, rushing to intercept. The frigate itself shook as it shifted, course sonar arrays pulsing. The battle had plunged into a dimension invisible to the naked eye. A war of blips and echoes fought in shadows. No sunlight touched. The first torpedoes came like phantoms. A shrill alarm wailed as the carrier registered incoming. Men scrambled to stations, bulkheads sealed, and the destroyers roared forward to shield it. Depth charges boomed, geysers of water leaping skyward, the sea itself trembling from the detonations. On sonar, the subs weaved and twisted, breaking into evasive maneuvers. The screen flared red torpedoes, darting like serpents, countermeasures firing in desperate bursts. Above the waves, Captain Reyes could only feel the tremors ripple through the deck. He looked at Tate, who was orchestrating the invisible duel. "They're not just after us," Tate growled. "They're baiting us into exposing comms." That was when it struck. The enemy launched not only torpedoes, but a barrage of electronic warfare. Suddenly, the screens blazed white static. Radar blanked. Communications went dead. The ship's systems flickered, lights dimmed, alarms sputtered. For a moment, the frigate floated blind, deaf, and naked in the dark.
Phoenix Squadron,
The enemy had
climb and hold
jammed them,
pattern.
flooding every frequency with waves of interference. Tate's team scrambled, slamming switches, rerouting power, trying to punch holes in the blanket of static. Sparks burst from a console, men cursed, and the command room pulsed with the frantic rhythm of desperation. It was a digital knife fight. Both fleets hurled electronic countermeasures like daggers, each trying to blind the other. Screens flashed, interfaces cut to black, then reignited with ghost signals. False contacts appeared, dozens of phantom submarines racing
Missile
across the
incoming!
displays. "They're spoofing us," Tate shouted, pounding the console. He dug deeper, stripping away noise, forcing focus until he locked on to the real threat. There, 2 clicks south, bearing down fast, destroyers moved to intercept the sea, erupting in thunder as depth charges hammered the abyss. The water lit up with flashes of underwater explosions, muffled but terrifying. And in that maelstrom, steel shrieked as one enemy sub was ripped open, its hull imploding like a crushed can. But more remained, weaving relentless. Meanwhile, on a blacked-out fast boat slicing through the waves, a team of special operators prepared for an even more impossible mission. Their orders were clear board the enemy fortress under cover of storm and chaos, sabotage its launch systems before it could recover. The boat skimmed close waves, slapping its hull rain, lashing their helmets. They said nothing. Silence was survival. They latched onto the side of the giant vessel, magnetic grips clamping onto its steel flank. One by one, they climbed dark figures against darker metal until they crested the deck. The world up there was hell. Fires burned from earlier strikes. Smoke twisted into the storm, and enemy soldiers patrolled through the haze. The team moved like shadows, silenced weapons hissing in short bursts. A guard fell with a muffled grunt. Another crumpled into the rain. Every step forward was a gamble between life and discovery. Inside the fortress, the operators planted charges, rigging explosives along conduits and fuel lines. The storm of gunfire above masked their movements, but time was bleeding out. One of them whispered into the comms charges set. 30 seconds. That was when the shout came. Enemy eyes had spotted them. Searchlights stabbed the rain, alarms shrieked, and gunfire erupted across the deck. The team sprinted for the edge, diving into the sea, just as the charges detonated. The explosion ripped through the superstructure, flames tearing upward into the storm, a wound carved into the monster's side. But victory came at a cost. Beneath the waves, the enemy had slipped a dagger past the defenses. A torpedo slammed into the carrier's flank. The explosion ripped the water open, hurling spray high into the air, the shockwave rocking ships miles away. Steel screamed, bulkheads ruptured, and men were flung across decks. The carrier groaned like a dying beast, listing heavily smoke billowing from its torn hull. On Reyes's frigate, Tate's eyes widened as the status board lit up crimson. Direct hit, the carrier's going down. The room fell into stunned silence. Reyes gripped the rail, his chest tight. Losing the carrier meant losing the heart of the fleet, the very platform that gave them air superiority. But there was no time to mourn. The choice came swift and merciless. Save the men, abandon the ship. Signal the evacuation. Reyes ordered, his voice low, each word heavy as stone. Lifeboats and rescue craft scrambled, pulling men from the tilting deck as the giant vessel sank lower into the sea. Helicopters darted overhead, hauling survivors into the storm. Tate slammed his fist against the console, fury breaking his calm. They forced us into this. We've lost the carrier, but not the war. As the great ship slipped beneath the waves, swallowed by fire and water, the fleet rallied around its wounded survivors. The enemy fortress still burned from the sabotage, but it stood. The ocean was littered with oil and men clinging to wreckage. In the storm's howling dark, both sides had drawn blood. Both had lost more than they could afford. Yet in that ruin, Reyes saw it clear. The war had shifted again into depths no man had ever fought before. The Pacific was no longer just sky and surface. It had become a graveyard below a battlefield of signals and silence, where survival was measured in seconds and every choice demanded sacrifice. And as the last lights of the carrier flickered out beneath the storm, the fleet braced for the next blow. The sea was still boiling from the loss of the carrier when the order no one wanted to hear finally came. Retreat. The fleet, bloodied and broken, had no choice but to pull back. Yet retreat did not mean survival. The only escape lay through a narrow strait, a choke point already sealed by enemy guns and subs. It was a corridor of fire, a place where even the strongest might crumble. And yet it was the only path left. On the bridge of his battered frigate, Captain Noah Reyes stared at the map glowing under the dim red lights.
I can't hold them off.
The strait was a death trap, but beyond it lay open waters and a chance to regroup. Behind them, the fortress prowled like a shark, ready to finish what it had started. Between those two jaws, Reyes and the fleet had to carve their way through. The haggard commander of the task force, Admiral Hensley, stood over the table, his eyes sunken with exhaustion. He carried not just the weight of steel, but the lives of thousands. "If we go forward, we bleed," Hensley said quietly. "If we stay, we die." His gaze shifted to Reyes. "What would you choose?" Reyes's answer came without hesitation. "Forward. We may not all make it, but some of us will. Better to burn through than to drown waiting." His words hung heavy in the room, but they carried the ring of truth. The decision was made. Operation Breakwater, one last gamble to punch through the strait before the enemy could tighten the noose. The fleet began to prepare. On the decks of destroyers and cruisers, sailors tightened straps, loaded shells, checked rifles. Pilots climbed into cockpits, the rain streaking their visors as they looked one another in the eye for what might be the last time. Engines roared, steel groaned, and across every ship men wrote silent farewells with their hands clasping comrades, whispering words drowned by the storm. Reyes stood before his crew, his voice steady, though his chest burned. "We go together, no one left behind. Whatever waits in that strait, we meet it head on." Among them was a boy hardly more than 19, Ensign Carter, fresh from training too young to be here, yet already hardened by fire. He clutched his rifle with trembling hands, not from fear, but from resolve. He thought of his family back home with a brother who had not come back from an earlier battle. He knew what was asked of him, and he did not flinch. The moment came. Engines screamed to life, the fleet locking into formation like a wall of steel. Fighters roared skyward, their contrails slashing white across the dark. Subhunters dove beneath the waves, sonar beating like drums. Every ship surged forward into the maw of the strait, the ocean heaving under their weight. Then the storm broke. From the cliffs and hidden coves, enemy guns lit the night shells raining down in arcs of fire. The sea erupted plumes of water, towering as shells tore into the waves. Destroyers answered with their own cannons. Decks, glowing orange with fire. Above, fighters clashed in a furious cyclone tracer, rounds streaking like meteors, missiles screaming through the clouds. Below, subs launched torpedoes that slithered through the dark, only to meet depth charges hammering back. It was chaos on every level, air, sea, and underworld, woven into one symphony of destruction. Reyes's frigate cut through the inferno, its guns, blazing men shouting as the hull shook under impacts. He stood firm on the bridge shouting, orders his voice rising above alarms and explosions. "Keep the line tight, push through, don't stop." His crew obeyed, faces set with grim determination. The ship lurched as a missile struck near its bow, but it held charging forward through smoke and flame. On the horizon, the fortress itself loomed again, its guns spewing a torrent of fire into the fleet. For every mile gained, a ship fell swallowed by explosions, torn apart by steel and water. Yet the line held inching closer to the other side. Then came the moment of sacrifice. A wave of enemy missiles streaked toward the heart of the formation, locked onto the carrier's replacement command ship. Reyes' frigate was too far to intercept, but another vessel, a small destroyer, limping from earlier wounds, turned into their pen. Its captain gave no order, but the wheel spoke louder than words. The ship surged forward, colliding with the barrage, its hull torn open in a blossom of fire. The explosion was apocalyptic, lighting the strait in a white blaze that seared itself into the eyes of every man watching. For a heartbeat, silence followed, and then the survivors roared forward with renewed fury. Amid the chaos, Ensign Carter found himself on the deck fire, licking the air bullets tearing through steel. A fellow sailor lay pinned under twisted metal, crying out as flames closed in. Without hesitation, Carter dropped his rifle and dove into the inferno, straining against the weight. He dragged the man free just as another blast rocked the deck. Shrapnel tore through Carter's side, the impact driving him to his knees. The sailor he saved pulled him close eyes wide with horror, but Carter only smiled, blood on his lips. "Keep going," he whispered. "Make it mean something." And then he was still. Reyes saw it all from the bridge, his throat tightening, his heart splintering under the weight of sacrifice. He had lost many men before, but watching
Phoenix
the young
Squadron,
give their lives
climb and
so
hold
willingly
pattern.
was a wound that never closed. He forced himself to stand taller, to honor them the only way he could by finishing the fight. The fleet surged in a final push, every gun firing, every engine screaming at its limit. Fighters dove into enemy lines. Subs torpedoed their last reserves. Destroyers charged with suicidal courage. And then, like a wave breaking through rock, they burst out of the strait. Behind them lay fire, ruin, and graves at sea, but ahead stretched open water, freedom earned at a price too heavy to count. On the bridge, silence settled for the first time in hours. Smoke curled from broken consoles. Men slumped, exhausted, blood and sweat mingling on their faces. Reyes leaned against the railing, staring at the horizon. They had made it. The breakthrough had worked. But the fleet was half gone. The carrier sunk, too many names already lost to the ocean. The admiral's voice broke over the comms, hoarse but unyielding. "We live to fight another day. Remember what it cost us. Remember who gave it." Reyes closed his eyes, Carter's face etched in his memory. May's sacrifice burning in the clouds above. Victory had come, but it was victory soaked in sorrow. The war was not over. It had only sharpened into something darker. And as the fleet limped toward the uncertain dawn, Reyes knew the next battle would demand even more. The breakthrough had been won, but dawn revealed the price in merciless detail. As the first light crept over the Pacific, the ocean stretched out like a graveyard. Smoke drifted in torn banners across the horizon, the water stained black with oil. Wreckage bobbed on the swells, broken hulls, shattered guns, fragments of wings. Here and there, bodies floated, faces turned skyward as though staring into eternity. It was victory carved from ruin, and the silence that followed was heavier than the storm of battle. Captain Noah Reyes stood on the scorched deck of his frigate, staring into that silence. His uniform was torn, his face lined with exhaustion, his eyes hollowed by the memories of what had been lost. He thought of May Alvarez, her jet diving like a dagger into the fortress launcher. He thought of young Carter, bloodied but unyielding, whispering, "Make it mean something," with his last breath. Their voices lived inside him, now echoes that would never fade. He had led his men through fire, but he carried the weight of those he could not bring back. The survivors moved slowly across the decks, patching holes, tending the wounded, pulling the lost from the sea. Each discovery of a fallen comrade was a fresh wound. And yet, amidst the grief, there was a fragile thread of pride that they had endured when all odds demanded their destruction. Reyes knew the men looked to him not for celebration, but for meaning. He owed them more than orders. He owed them truth. At noon, the fleet gathered what remained of its strength and held a ceremony upon the waves. The dead were laid out on deck flags covering their bodies. Men lined the rails in silence, the sea their only witness. The chaplain's voice trembled over the wind, prayers rising with the cries of gulls circling above. When the final words were spoken, the bodies were slid gently into the water, one by one, swallowed by the endless blue. A ship's horn wailed a long, mournful cry that echoed across the horizon. Every man bowed his head, the sound carving into their souls. Reyes stood at the front hand, raised in salute, his throat tight as the bodies drifted away. He saw May in his mind, her face lit by cockpit fire, her voice steady as she chose sacrifice. He saw Carter, a boy who had become a hero in his last breath. These were not statistics. They were lives burned into the memory of every man who remained.
Oh my God!
And it was Reyes' burden to ensure their sacrifice was not forgotten. Later that day, small boats were dispatched to a nearby island.
Mayday!
Reports
Mayday!
had come
We're taking
that
heavy
civilians,
fire!
fishermen,
Get a lock!
families had been stranded there since the battle began. The boats returned hours later, carrying men, women, and children whose faces bore the same exhaustion but also the same flicker of hope. Sailors reached out with steady hands, lifting them aboard, offering blankets and water. For a brief moment, the war receded, replaced by something fragile and human. Reyes watched a sailor kneel to give a child his rations. And in that simple act, he saw the answer to the question that had haunted him. Why fight when so much is lost? The answer was in their faces because survival meant more than ships and guns. It meant preserving life, dignity, and hope. As the sun dipped lower, a lighthouse appeared on the island's edge. Its glass had been shattered during the bombardment, but the survivors rebuilt it with what they could salvage. At dusk, a flame flickered inside, and slowly the beacon blazed to life, cutting through the smoke and the dark. The men on deck fell silent, watching that light rise. It was more than a navigational signal. It was a symbol. Proof that even in ruins, something could be rebuilt, something could endure. That night, Reyes returned to his cabin. He sat in silence, the map before him stained with ash, his hands trembling. He no longer saw lines of battle or enemy positions. He saw faces, May's determination, Carter's defiance, the tears of sailors who had lowered their brothers into the sea. And in that silence, he realized the war had changed. It was no longer about fortress ships or superweapons. It was about endurance, about the will of ordinary men and women to stand against annihilation. By morning, the fleet had set its course. Engines coughed to life, battered hulls strained forward, but they moved together a scarred yet unbroken armada. Reyes stood on the bridge, staring at the rising Sunday. Its light spilled across the shattered sea, turning the oil-slick waters into molten gold. For the first time in days, warmth touched his face. Behind him, the men stood taller, their eyes clearer. They had survived not because of the strength of steel, but because of each other. The final message was clear: war was no longer decided by the size of guns or the weight of ships. It was decided by spirit, by the unyielding sacrifice of those willing to give everything. The enemy had sought to crush them with overwhelming power, but in doing so had awakened something stronger, a unity that no weapon could break. As the camera pulls back, the fleet sails on beneath the blazing dawn. The sea is still scarred, littered with wreckage, but above it, the light grows brighter, spilling over the horizon. The lighthouse gleams behind them, a sentinel of rebirth. And as the shot rises higher, revealing the vastness of the ocean and the small fleet that had defied extinction, one truth lingers: victory was not the absence of loss, but the refusal to surrender to it. The horn sounds one last time, a low cry across the waves, not of mourning, but of defiance. And then the horizon swallows it all, the title burning across the screen as the sun crowns the sea, a promise that the world, scarred though it was, would endure. The ocean that once roared with fire and steel now lies quiet, but its silence carries the weight of sacrifice. From the storm of the skies to the darkness beneath the waves, from the desperate charge through the strait to the haunting dawn of wreckage, every moment revealed the same truth: war is not won by machines alone. It is carried forward by human will, by choices made in the most impossible hours, by the courage of those who give everything so that others may live. May Alvarez, diving into the fortress guns. Ensign Carter, saving a comrade with his last breath. The sailors who refused to abandon their brothers. All of them remind us that strength is measured not in firepower, but in spirit. This battle is more than a chapter in history. It is a mirror for every generation that stands at the edge of fear and must decide whether to yield or to push forward. The fleet survived not because it was invincible, but because men and women chose to fight together, to place duty above self, to believe that tomorrow was worth the price of today. As the sun rose over a sea of ashes, the light of a single lighthouse cut through the smoke proof that even in ruin there is rebirth. That light is not only for those who fought on the Pacific, but for all of us. It calls on us to remember that freedom demands vigilance, that peace is earned by sacrifice, and that unity is the only shield strong enough to withstand the storms of history. Let us not look away from the cost, but honor it by carrying forward what they fought for. The story does not end at sea. It continues in the choices we make, the courage we uphold, and the light we keep burning against the darkness.